conversation. So we're very happy to be able to do this for you all. My name is Fatima Syed. You may know me as a journalist with the Narwhal's brand new Ontario Bureau. I'm also the host of The Backbench, a podcast about Canadian politics, and many other things that I've been writing. But before we dig into this conversation, I'd like to do some brief housekeeping as you all trickle in. We have translation tonight, and we've got closed caption services available for this webinar. And if you're looking for translation, please click the globe icon on the bottom of the window to enable a French language soundtrack. Please note that the translation feature is not supported if you're using your phone for audio, so you do have to be on your laptop. For those of you who are not familiar with using interpretation services, just a heads up that it is normal that what you hear is not as fluid as usual. Remember that there's a human being, in this case, our interpreter, Madeleine, who has to translate every speaker's word as we go. You're very welcome to join in the conversation through the chat function. Please feel free to send questions or comments. Keep in mind that our chat moderators are closely monitoring that conversation, and any abusive language won't be tolerated. Any breach of this rule will result in the removal of the Zoom call.
Merci, Fatima. Au nom du réseau Action Climat, ça me fait vraiment plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue ce soir à notre table ronde sur le leadership climatique pour l'élection 2021. Je m'appelle Caroline Brouillette, je suis directrice des politiques climatiques au réseau Action Climat Canada, qui est le plus large réseau d'organisations qui travaillent ensemble contre les changements climatiques au Canada. Je me joins à vous de terre non cédée Gagnan-Guéhaga à Montréal ou Tchatchaké. Donc, les membres du réseau Action Climat rassemblent plus de 130 organisations, des groupes environnementaux, des syndicats, des Premières Nations, des organisations de justice sociale, de développement, de santé et de jeunesse, des groupes religieux et des initiatives locales. Un petit rappel que ce soir, on a des interprètes avec nous, donc cliquez sur la petite icône de globe en bas de la fenêtre pour activer l'interprétation dans la langue de votre choix. Notez que la fonction de traduction n'est pas prise en charge si vous utilisez votre téléphone pour l'audio. C'est normal si ce que vous entendez n'est pas aussi fluide que si vous n'aviez pas d'interprétation. Il y a un humain en chair et en os qui traduit nos propos au fur et à mesure. Dans ce cas-ci, c'est notre interprète Siro. Alors, bonne soirée tout le monde et merci d'être avec nous.
So I'm now going to introduce our panelists. We've got Dan Albas for the Conservative Party, Laurel Collins from the NDP, Kristina Michaud from Bloc Québécois, Dr. Imre Szeman from the Green Party, and Jonathan Wilkinson from the Liberal Party, and Environment Minister at the moment. Thank you all for being here. A very quick overview of the format. We're going to have 2-minute opening statements in random order where these panelists can pitch their climate platforms to you all. We're going to go through a series of topics, including Indigenous rights, the urgency of getting to zero emissions, just transition, and leaving no one behind. Each candidate has 2 minutes to answer the question, and there will be a few minutes for follow-up questions from me and Caro. One last follow-up question to each party at the end will also be done by me, so look forward to that. Cards will be shown when there are 30 seconds left to each panelist, which we've already gone through with them. So if you see someone holding up a green card, that's just 30 seconds left, and then yellow means time's almost up. We're expecting this to be a constructive discussion where we aren't interested in only hearing attacks on the other parties and talking points. We'd love to hear your ideas, your vision, and how you'll work together to bring about serious climate action. This entire webinar will be recorded and it will be available afterwards on CAN-Rac's Facebook and YouTube pages. During this event, feel free to join the conversation. Like I said, in the chat and on Twitter, you can use the hashtag Let's Talk Climate. So over to Caro for the first question.
Okay, let's get on va commencer. Désolée, mon anglais a pris le dessus. Alors, c'est maintenant le temps des remarques d'introduction. Pour vous guider, chers candidats et candidates, on aimerait que vous nous brossiez un portrait de la façon dont votre plan et vos propositions climatiques rendront la vie plus sécuritaire, plus juste et plus heureuse pour les Canadiennes et Canadiens. Donc, c'est vraiment le moment de nous faire rêver. Fatima va nous donner l'ordre dans lequel les candidats vont répondre.
Ms. Collins, please go first.
Thanks so much. I want to first acknowledge that I am zooming in from the homelands of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. And I want to thank everyone who's joining the call, and especially thank Climate Action Network for organizing this really important discussion. Over the past year, we have seen record-breaking heat waves, climate fires, extreme weather. You know, this conversation right now is so critical because climate action is so critical. So the NDP is committed to ensuring that we have a bold, ambitious plan that will cut our emissions in half by 2030, ensuring that we stay below 1.5 degree warming. We need to make sure that we are investing in retrofits, in renewables, in transportation mode shift, in all of the climate solutions that we know are so desperately needed. We also need to stop doing a lot of the things that this current government has been doing, including handing out billions of dollars to big oil and gas companies. We need to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. We also need to stop buying pipelines and spending billions of dollars expanding them. We need to put all of those billions into climate solutions. It is so critically important that we take climate action, and that we take climate action with a lens that includes justice for all, and justice for workers, for the communities who are most impacted by the climate crisis, Indigenous communities, racialized communities, low income, communities who are both on the front lines with the impacts, but also have important knowledge and insight and can help guide our path forward. This is so critical that we take climate action. Canadians are tired of empty words and broken promises. We need climate action now.
Thank you, Ms. Collins. Ms. Michaud, over to you.
Merci. Bonsoir tout le monde. Merci à Lauren et Caroline pour l'opportunité de parler climat ce soir. Et j'étais assez soulagée de voir que je pouvais m'exprimer dans ma langue maternelle. Alors, merci aux interprètes qui sont là avec nous ce soir. C'est extrêmement apprécié. Je m'appelle Kristina Michaud. Je suis députée d'Avignon-L'Amitié, ce matin de Matapédia, et j'étais la porte-parole du Bloc québécois en matière de changement climatique dans la dernière législature. Je suis une environnementaliste et c'est une des raisons pour laquelle j'ai choisi le Bloc québécois, parce qu'on a des positions assez fortes en matière d'environnement, et je pense qu'en pleine crise climatique, c'est d'autant plus important d'avoir des positions fortes, et on a des propositions qui sont ambitieuses, qui sont prometteuses, qui sont vertes, qui sont durables pour le Québec, mais aussi pour l'ensemble du Canada, pour aider à faire cette fameuse transition énergétique. Et pour nous, c'est indéniable, il faut diminuer nos émissions de gaz à effet de serre, et pour ça, bien, il faut aller au-delà de mettre des cibles qui sont ambitieuses, mais il faut faire les efforts nécessaires pour les atteindre. Et pour nous, ça passe par la fin de l'augmentation des productions de sable bitumineux, et il faut réduire progressivement la production totale de pétrole brut. On est conscient que ça ne peut pas se faire du jour au lendemain. Le Canada est quand même un pays pétrolier, mais il faut le faire graduellement, mais tout à fait rapidement. On propose aussi d'annuler tous les projets qui sont polluants, comme l'oléoduc Trans Mountain, et à la place, prendre ces sommes-là pour financer la transition énergétique. Au Bloc québécois, on a des propositions qui sont nouvelles aussi, comme celle d'instaurer un test climat pour l'ensemble des politiques fédérales qui vont être mises en place dans le futur, donc pour mesurer l'impact sur l'environnement des futures décisions gouvernementales. On propose aussi une idée de péréquation verte qui consisterait à récompenser les efforts des provinces qui luttent vraiment contre les changements climatiques, donc celles qui émettent plus de GES. Et là, je vois que mon temps est fini, mais je pourrais revenir là-dessus avec plaisir.
Merci, Ms. Michaud. Mr. Wilkinson, over to you. Oh, I think you might be muted, sir.
Thank you for the invitation to be here. I want to start by acknowledging that I am located on the unceded ancestral territories of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I also want to thank all of those present for the hard work that you all do in your communities. Nous partageons de nombreux objectifs communs. Nous croyons à la science du climat, à la promotion de solutions dirigées par les autochtones, au soutien des travailleurs et des communautés. Ces valeurs ont sous-tendu les actions de notre gouvernement en matière d'environnement. Canada's Strengthened Climate Plan outlines concrete actions in every sector and every region. We are using every tool to enable Canada to achieve its more ambitious climate targets. Core to that plan, obviously, is putting a price on pollution at a level required to see net zero as an objective, while returning monies to families to use as they see fit. The price on pollution was recently reaffirmed by the Supreme Court, which is a major victory for all of us. However, precisely because we are driven by science and the urgency of the crisis, we know that more is required. Our platform includes additional measures, including stronger methane regulations, a regulated ramp down of emissions from the oil and gas sector, regulations to require we have 100% non-emitting electricity by 2035, and a ban on the export of thermal coal. The passage of the Net Zero Accountability Act has put the 40 to 45% target into law, which raises questions, I think, for the Conservative Party if it were to form government, given its commitment to roll back Canada's Paris target. In fact, the Paris Agreement requires countries to increase ambition over time. To suggest Canada reduce its target is to reject the core principles of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement took years worth of consensus building, of negotiation. Mr. O'Toole is indicating he is planning to tear up Canada's contribution to the agreement. And so I guess in closing, I would say directly to my Conservative counterpart that it is absolutely unconscionable, Dan, that your party is working and campaigning on weakening Canada's target. And I think that's a question that you should probably address in this forum.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkinson. Mr. Albas, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much to the Climate Action Network for inviting me today. This is an exciting time for Canada. The Conservative Party has a lot of ideas that we are bringing to the table in this election when it comes to climate change. My leader, Erin O'Toole, talks often about net zero, the need for us to move towards it. We also have been talking about ESG and how we can see more investment in Canadian, whether that be energy or in clean tech. And also we've been talking about the need to have more Indigenous economic reconciliation. We know that there are many First Nation communities that want to be part of the natural resource sector, but they also want to do it in an environmentally sensitive way. So our Secure the Environment platform was debuted in April so that we could bring it to the Canadian people. We could start having discussions about it. And there's been a great response to it because obviously there is a carbon pricing mechanism in that. We are going to be looking to, as a British Columbia, I'm very excited, not just because there's so many other British Columbians here today, pardon Madame Michaud, but I'm proud of that, but also because we're taking things like a renewable natural gas mandate, a electric vehicle mandate, a low carbon fuel standard, all things that British Columbia does well, but we're going to roll it out as a national mandate. And these ideas will help us to achieve our Paris targets. Now, Mr. Wilkinson would like to have you believe that the new 40% to 45% range, is the Canadian targets. That may be a fact right now. That is something they changed recently, but Canada's never met any of its climate goals. We need to start getting people to work. We also need to be serious about climate. And so we have a plan that will do that. And I'm very excited to talk about it today, while helping more Canadians put food on the table and seeing more Indigenous communities be part of our economic recovery.
Thank you. And last but not least, Mr. Simon.
Yeah, it's Zeman, just.
I'm so sorry, Zeman.
No problem. So the real goal of climate policy is a 100% reduction of new greenhouse gas emissions. It's not 30, not 40, not even 50. And certainly not by the magical date of 2050, but with all the haste and speed we can manage. And climate policy has to also be about accumulated levels of greenhouse gases. Getting to net zero doesn't get rid of all the stuff already there, which is why faster is better. So the real question of climate policy is what's standing in the way of making this possible? Now, some of the slowdown is understandable. Our economies and societies have been shaped around fossil fuels. It's something I've studied as a researcher for 20 years. I know the transition is a huge challenge, but this isn't the only reason things are going slower than they should. Canadian governments haven't made any reductions in emissions since 2005. We're one of the highest per capita emitters in the world. We're at the bottom of the list on climate action. There have been so many promises made and there'll be more made tonight. We've already heard some of them. They've all been broken. They've been broken by parties in power or who have held the balance of power. Other governments in the world have managed to reduce their emissions drastically, even while growing their economies. So it's clear that action, it's possible to take action, but somehow Canadians have made it impossible. The Green Party here is the only one serious about climate change. Our policies have been developed around evidence and not gut feelings. We know what happens when you arrive slow to an emergency. We don't intend that to happen to Canada or to Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your opening statements. We're going to get into our first question, which is going to be about Indigenous rights. Caro?
Yes, merci Fatima. Donc, pour le réseau Action Climat, c'est clair que l'action climatique ne peut être séparée du projet plus large d'autodétermination des peuples autochtones et de la décolonisation. C'est pour ça que nous appelons tous les partis à mettre pleinement en œuvre les 94 appels à l'action de la Commission de la vérité et réconciliation et à mettre pleinement et sincèrement en œuvre la Déclaration des Nations unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones. Ce qu'on aimerait savoir de vous ce soir, chers candidates et candidats, c'est de quelle façon, pour vous et votre parti, les droits autochtones et l'action climatique sont interreliés. Donc, je vais nommer les candidates et candidats un à un. On va commencer avec Madame Michaud du Bloc québécois.
Merci pour la question. Bien, en fait, je pense que ça ne devrait pas en être une. Il est clair pour le Bloc québécois que les droits autochtones et l'action climatique sont absolument interreliés. Et d'abord, je dois dire que le Bloc québécois a travaillé très fort avec les organisations nationales des Premières Nations, des Métis, des Inuits pour déposer et faire adopter à l'unanimité en juin dernier à la Chambre des communes une motion qui exige du gouvernement qui presse le pas pour réaliser les 94 appels à l'action de la Commission vérité et réconciliation. Et bon, dans un avenir rapproché, le Bloc ne manquera pas de rappeler au gouvernement et aux autres partis la promesse qu'ils ont faite. Et ce, peu importe le gouvernement qui sera élu le 20 septembre prochain. On ne lâchera pas le morceau tant et aussi longtemps que les appels à l'action de la Commission Vérité et Réconciliation ne seront pas mis en œuvre. Maintenant, pourquoi c'est interrelié et pourquoi c'est important? Eh bien, surtout parce que les nations autochtones ont une perspective unique dans la lutte contre les changements climatiques et nous, bien, on continue d'encourager un travail collaboratif pour trouver des solutions structurantes pour atteindre nos objectifs de réduction des gaz à effet de serre, mais aussi pour atteindre des objectifs en matière de mitigation et d'adaptation aux conséquences des bouleversements climatiques. Donc, pour nous, c'est certain que tout ça doit être fait en collaboration. Et d'ailleurs, je me permettrais d'ajouter que le Bloc québécois est absolument favorable à l'intégration des priorités climatiques des Premières Nations aux programmes fédéraux. Et sincèrement, je pense que si on veut véritablement se réconcilier avec les peuples autochtones, bien, leurs droits doivent être considérés dans toutes les décisions qu'on prend et même ceux qu'on a prises dans le passé et particulièrement celles qui étaient discriminatoires envers leurs droits. Alors, je pense que dans une perspective de lutte au changement climatique, comme dans toutes les autres luttes sociales qu'on doit mener, on doit prendre acte des droits autochtones et leur faire une place dans cette lutte-là comme des alliés.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Michaud. On va maintenant passer au ministre Wilkinson.
Merci. La réconciliation avec les peuples autochtones est une priorité centrale pour le Parti libéral. Nous sommes pleinement engagés à mettre en œuvre les appels à l'action de la Commission de vérité et de réconciliation. Since 2015, we have made significant progress on implementation. I am also very pleased to say that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act received royal assent on June 21st. The act requires the Government of Canada to take all measures necessary to align federal laws with that declaration. We will take a whole-of-government approach to implementing UNDRIP, including a requirement to implement UNDRIP in the mandate letters of all cabinet ministers. Indigenous peoples are also key partners as we work to protect more of nature, conserve biodiversity, and certainly to combat climate change. Indigenous-led conservation will continue to play a central role in a Liberal government's commitment to conserve 30% of land and marine areas by 2030. We've already invested in and worked actively on 100 Indigenous-led conservation initiatives. In budget 2021, we committed an additional $340 million in new dedicated funding to support Indigenous leadership in nature conservation. Indigenous leadership and perspectives also play a critical role in Canada's work to address climate change. We established bilateral tables with First Nations, with Métis and Inuit partners aimed at building collaborative approaches for engagement with Indigenous peoples in the development and the implementation of the climate plan. In addition, Regional Chief Kluani Adamak and Teresa Bakey, an Inuit leader, were appointed to the Net Zero Advisory Body. A re-elected Liberal government will build on these strong accomplishments and partnerships. We will work with Indigenous leaders to support new Indigenous Guardians programs, to support Indigenous communities to establish more Indigenous conserved and protected spaces, and to advocate for Indigenous rights, in particular regarding land and water stewardship internationally.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre. I'll just do a quick update on technical stuff because I'm seeing a lot of Anglophone comments in the chat about our interpretation. Just a friendly reminder, folks, that if you wish to hear the discussion in English or in French, please click the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and you can choose the language you'll be listening to this discussion in. Just a friendly reminder that the translation is audio. So thank you for that. On va maintenant passer au prochain candidat, Monsieur Szeman.
Thank you. There can be no action on climate change without honoring Indigenous rights in Canada. Full stop. The Green Party sees climate action and Indigenous rights as indelibly interlinked. As outlined in our 2021 platform, the development of federal climate policy and just transition programs of environmental justice and ecosystem conservation foregrounds the involvement of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, drawing on their traditional knowledges, wisdom, and connection to this land, to their land. We support Indigenous-led protected and conservation areas and will fund stewardship of these lands and waters and work with the provinces and First Nations to put an immediate halt to the logging of endangered old growth ecosystems, something which current governments seem not to have had much interest in doing, as evidenced by recent events at Fairy Creek. At least they haven't had very much interest in doing this until the election. Just one example of how we see Indigenous people as key to the development of climate policy can be seen in our plan to create an independent, scientific, nonpartisan climate council to advise the government on climate policy on an ongoing basis, which will include First Nations, Inuit, and Métis representation, and youth and representation from communities most affected by the climate emergency. At the beginning of this year, the Green Party proposed an amendment to Bill C-12, the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, which would have created just such an advisory board. But hearings about this amendment were ended before the House could hear testimony from youth, climate scientists, or Indigenous people. Clearly, making certain that Indigenous peoples contribute to climate policy in a meaningful way doesn't seem to be a priority for all Canadian parties. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Szeman. On va ensuite passer à Monsieur Albas du Parti conservateur.
Great, thank you so much. Indigenous reconciliation is important to my leader. It's important to my party. It's important to me. And most importantly, it's important to all Canadians who want to see reconciliation. Ever since we saw the discovery of those mass graves, unmarked graves at Kamloops, there's been an outpouring. And I believe that we must honor and listen to Indigenous voices. I joined the debates that happened, and I raised the voices of people in my area, like Chief Harvey McLeod, who was a survivor himself at that school. And it's important for us to continue to work in partnership. I've talked earlier about natural resource development, but also there are clean tech and other environmental initiatives that First Nations would like to partner with. And that's something that the Conservative Party, we want to do. My leader's first question as the new leader of the official opposition in the House of Commons was on reconciliation. This is an incredibly important thing. We need to have all levels of government. We need to have all stratas of Canadian society look to the 94 calls to action done by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We know that those calls to action 71 through 76, we need to do immediately, and we need to have better mechanisms to work with First Nations so we keep prioritizing and keeping those calls to action on the top of the federal government's mind. My leader has also retained a special advisor on UNDRIP, and we will work with other parliamentarians and we will work with First Nations directly in order to facilitate reconciliation on Indigenous communities' terms. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Albas. Et finalement, on passe à Madame Collins du Nouveau Parti démocratique.
Thanks so much. And upholding Indigenous rights is essential if we want to be effective in climate action, and it is essential if we want environmental justice. Indigenous communities are the original stewards of their territories, and they are best placed to protect the cultural and biological diversity through control of their own territories. New Democrats are committed to fully implementing the 94 calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, also fully implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we are going to put reconciliation at the heart of our approach to addressing the climate crisis. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities must be full and equal partners in our path to a low carbon future. And it means ensuring that Indigenous leadership is at the table, at the high level decision-making tables, and actually involved in directing Canada's efforts to confront the climate crisis. It also means making sure there are opportunities for renewable energy projects and sustainable energy in remote communities. It means expanding the Indigenous Guardian program, investing in Indigenous-led stewardship, investing in Indigenous-led science, and the creation of Indigenous-managed protected areas. We are going to ensure that our recovery efforts for species at risk respect Indigenous rights and embrace traditional knowledge, that we are protecting and restoring the wild Pacific salmon populations here on the West Coast. Indigenous communities are not only stewards of their territories, they're also on the front lines and disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. So we need to make sure that we take a fundamentally different approach to our future, and one that recognizes Indigenous rights, that upholds Indigenous rights, and recognizes the knowledge and respects Indigenous sovereignty.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Collins. Just before we go to follow-ups, we're still getting lots of comments about the translation and interpretation in the chat. A reminder to all of our speakers and to me and my co-moderator to speak slowly so the interpretation is as audible as possible. And a reminder too to participants that there are real people doing interpretation live as we're speaking. It's a really tough job, so please be understanding. Thanks.
So my first follow-up question is for Ms. Collins from the NDP. It's great to hear all of you make commitments to include Indigenous voices and Indigenous decision-making in climate action policies in the future. But Ms. Collins, in the past, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh has expressed support for the Coastal GasLink LNG project, which faces opposition from the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. What's the party's current position on this project?
When Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs were calling on this prime minister to meet with them, Jagmeet stood up in the House of Commons and echoed those calls, asking the prime minister to meet with the hereditary leadership. Since then, he has been in the House of Commons, in the media. He has said that fracking must be part of our past. It cannot be part of our future. We need to rapidly transition away from fossil fuels, and we need to make sure that we are listening to the voices of Indigenous peoples.
Merci, Madame Collins. Prochaine question pour Monsieur Albas. Vous parlez beaucoup de réconciliation économique dans votre plateforme, tandis qu'on voit aussi dans votre plateforme une proposition de mettre de l'avant une législation pour protéger les infrastructures critiques qui préviendrait les manifestants de bloquer des infrastructures clés lorsque ces manifestants sont historiquement principalement des communautés autochtones qui protègent leurs droits et leur territoire.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. It's really important that we get a balance right in Canada people have a right to protest. They have a right to hear or to say what is on their minds, and they should be listened to. Right now, we see more division in this country because of the way that the Trudeau government talks and doesn't listen. We need to change this. In some cases, there are provincial governments like the pipeline that Ms. Collins was mentioning, that's governed through the province of British Columbia. But there should always be avenues for people to speak with elected officials. That's something that I try to do. But at the same token, we always have to have a balance of where someone can express themselves, but to do so safely, where it doesn't jeopardize the safety of the protesters or the safety of other people. So we will try to get that balance. We will trust and work with the authorities, particularly the courts, to make sure that our laws are just and fair to all. And we will make sure that that balance is maintained.
Our last follow-up question in this portion of the conversation goes to Mr. Wilkinson. A simple yes or no, I guess. Does consultation and consent with Indigenous people include the right to say no?
Well, we went through quite a long process of what consultation and accommodation means associated with the Trans Mountain Pipeline. As you will know, the courts essentially said initially that the Crown had not fully discharged its requirement to consult and accommodate. And so there was quite a long period of time where the government reached out in a number of different areas and was guided by one of the justices of the former justice of the Supreme Court in terms of doing that, and worked very hard to try to not only consult, but to accommodate as much as possible. That is the duty of the Crown. And I think in law, it's now been pretty well documented in terms of what is required. It's certainly a lot more than a box checking exercise. There is an enormous amount of work that has to be done to ensure that you have fully discharged the duty to consult and to accommodate.
Thank you. We're now going to move on to our second topic. This will be about the oil and gas sector. A recent report published in the leading journal Nature tells us that nearly 60% of oil and fossil fuel and methane gas and 90% of coal must remain unextracted to keep within a 1.5 degrees Celsius carbon budget. Earlier this summer, the International Energy Agency issued a landmark report which found that in order to have a chance of meeting a global net zero by 2050, the world will no longer tolerate any investment in new fossil fuel supply projects. How does your party respond to the science and the global call for a phase out of fossil fuels, including coal, oil, and gas? We will start with, my apologies, my Google Doc is being weird. Once it sorts itself out, we're going to start with Mr. Wilkinson.
Okay, thank you for the question. The climate science is pretty clear. Eliminating the use of thermal coal is a critical first step towards the achievement of the Paris goals. The oil and gas sector, though, must also make real progress in reducing emissions on a pathway to net zero by 2050. When we took office in 2015, Canada's emissions were projected to be 12% higher in 2030 than they were in 2005. Since then, we have broken the upward trajectory of those emissions, and Canada's emissions right now are 1% lower, and they are projected to fall every year between now and 2030. Canada's Paris Agreement emissions reduction target is 40 to 45%. That is what is filed with the United Nations. Our Strengthened Climate Plan, coupled with measures that are contained in the campaign platform, will enable us to achieve that target. Expert assessments of the climate plan, including the recent assessment by Professor Jacquard at SFU, demonstrate that we're on track to achieve Canada's strengthened target. En ce qui concerne le charbon, nous avions précédemment exigé l'élimination progressive de charbon thermique et indiqué que les nouvelles mines de charbon thermique ne seraient pas construites. Dans notre plateforme, nous sommes allés plus loin et indiquons que nous interdirons l'exportation de charbon thermique. With respect to oil and gas emissions, in Canada, they've risen 20% since 2005, and they now make up 26% of Canada's emissions. We must see significant reductions in oil and gas emissions as part of any credible climate plan. Our platform commits to capping emissions on the oil and gas sector and requiring 5-year binding reduction targets aligned with achieving net zero by 2050. We will set the 2025 and 2030 targets based on advice from the Net Zero Advisory Body, a group of experts that includes your former executive director of your organization, Catherine Abreu. Other relevant measures in our platform include accelerating our G20 commitment to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and phasing out public financing of the fossil fuel sector, including crown corporations like Export Development Canada. The bottom line is that the oil and gas sector needs to contribute its share to Canada's climate effort.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkinson. Mr. Albas.
Great, thank you so much for the question. There are many opportunities that Canada can have to lower emissions at home and abroad. We certainly can simply see the amount of investment that has left this country since the Trudeau government has taken office. And so right now, many energy companies are not planning new projects. So what we have to ask ourselves is that how do we work with the energy sector to lower the emissions that are there? One of the things that's in our platform is that if someone has a project that can lower emissions, we will fast track that. That's an exceptionally important thing. But Mr. Wilkinson talked about banning the export of thermal coal. Most of the coal that is exported out of Canada is actually American. It will simply just go through different ports. And so if we're going to make a difference as a country in the elimination of the use of coal, we need to give the world an opportunity to change. So we do have LNG, liquefied natural gas. We can utilize renewable energy sources such as hydro to have some of the cleanest liquefied natural gas and export that to displace coal-powered electricity. There are ways that we can help to see new investments, to lower emissions, to include Indigenous communities, and that's by working with provinces. One of the other things that's in the Liberal platform that I think it's important to ask the question of is they said they're going to cap emissions from the energy sector. I don't believe the Constitution works that way. So maybe Mr. Wilkinson can back up how exactly he's going to do that. I think it's important that all of us recognize that climate change is an all hands on deck approach, and we need to deal with our emissions both at home and abroad while giving people the chance to put food on the table and include Indigenous communities as part of economic reconciliation.
Mr. Szeman.
All right, just before I begin, I'd ask Mr. Wilkinson to read my response to Mr. Jacquard's article in Policy Options. It certainly helps one's position to read only what one likes, and the Liberal Party has been doing that without looking at any of the other critiques of that particular position. So let me also provide a clarification and some context. The figures provided by Nature actually give higher figures for Canada. The report states that 83% of this country's oil reserves, 81% of its gas, 83% of its coal will have to stay in the ground to achieve our climate targets. It's not the 60% that the question asks. I also want to give some comments, some context about the IEA. It was established by the OECD in the wake of the '73 oil crisis, and it was tasked with providing data to member states on oil markets, which means, really, if the IEA says that fossil fuels have to stay in the ground, then we can be sure that they have to stay. I feel that neither Mr. Albas or Mr. Wilkinson really wanted to answer your question. They wanted to avoid the elephant in the climate policy room, and that is fossil fuels. Given the figures that I just gave you, we have to end the production of fossil fuels in Canada. We have to end new projects, and we have to bring an end to existing oil and gas operations on a declining basis until they're phased out between 2030 and 2035. This is based on evidence-based research about emissions targets. And I don't see any other way we can do this. I know that some have offered solutions such as carbon capture or blue hydrogen. They're both techno-utopian ideals. At present, carbon capture manages to address about 0.1% of emissions. And blue hydrogen, according to researchers at Cornell and Stanford, it's more than 20% greater than burning either natural gas or coal directly. The fossil fuel era is over. It's time to get on with Canada's energy future. Anything else is just trying to, stay the inevitable. Thanks.
Ms. Michaud.
Merci. Je comprends qu'il y a un enjeu de traduction, donc je vais tenter de parler un petit peu plus lentement, même si 2 minutes est si vite passé. La science est claire et au Bloc québécois, on croit à la science. Donc, c'est évident pour nous qu'il faut diminuer nos émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Il faut changer nos façons de faire, il faut changer nos façons de produire. Il faut commencer à penser à décarboniser notre économie, justement. Et oui, le Canada est un pays pétrolier, mais on a des belles choses au Québec aussi. On a l'hydroélectricité, on a l'énergie éolienne, l'énergie solaire. Alors, je pense qu'on peut mettre toutes ces belles énergies durable et verte à profit, plutôt que de continuer d'envoyer l'argent des contribuables québécois et canadiens dans les énergies fossiles. Je pense que ce n'est pas une façon responsable de dépenser l'argent des contribuables. Alors, pour nous, c'est clair qu'il faut avoir une trajectoire énergétique qui est compatible avec la limitation de la hausse des températures à 1,5 degré Celsius. Pour ça, il faut cesser l'augmentation de la production des sables bitumineux. Il faut réduire progressivement la production de pétrole brut le plus rapidement possible. Si on a cet objectif de carboneutralité en 2050, eh bien, il faut commencer à avoir des années jalons avant et avoir des objectifs clairs et des gestes clairs pour atteindre les cibles. Alors, tout projet d'élargissement d'oléoduc, comme on le voit avec Trans Mountain ou tout autre nouveau projet, il faut s'afficher clairement contre ces projets-là. Et bon, je pense que le Québec et toutes les autres provinces ne sont pas des corridors énergétiques. On a trop de belles rivières, de beaux lacs, un beau fleuve aussi qu'on ne veut pas mettre en péril avec le transport d'énergie polluante à travers tout ça. Alors, je pense que c'est une position claire au Bloc québécois qui est honnête également. Je pense que tous les partis auraient intérêt à avoir une position honnête par rapport à cela. On le sait que l'énergie la plus polluante, c'est les énergies gazières et pétrolières. Alors, je pense qu'il faut commencer à transitionner vers les énergies qui sont plus durables, qui sont plus vertes. On aurait dû le faire il y a vraiment longtemps, mais là, c'est plus que jamais le temps de le faire.
Merci. Finally, Ms. Collins.
Thanks so much. And we need to stop creating new fossil fuel infrastructure. The IPCC has issued a code red for humanity. They are telling us that we need to cut our emissions globally in half by 2030. And there's no way to do that if we are continuing to expand new fossil fuel infrastructure. We need to follow the science. And it is disappointing to see this government setting targets that are below what the top global scientists are telling us will be necessary, and then saying that we're on track to meeting those targets when today Climate Tracker showed how actually our record and our commitments are highly insufficient, that we're actually on track to a global warming of 4 degrees. And that is devastating. That would mean some of the most catastrophic impacts of the climate crisis. We need our government to actually do what it says. The promises to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies are so essential. We are handing over billions of dollars to big oil and gas companies. We are actually fueling the climate crisis. And every time I hear this government say they are committed to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, they are committed to ending fossil fuel subsidies, I want to hold up the record. The record is that we have increased our fossil fuel subsidies every year, and on average, $900 million. We need to stop funding the climate crisis and start funding the solutions, the climate solutions. We, as New Democrats, are committed to tackling the climate crisis, to eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, to cutting emissions by more than half by 2030, and to also create hundreds of thousands of jobs in the low carbon economy. We need a just transition for workers. We need to actually invest in the future. And it is the future for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren. This is so essential. We need climate action now.
Thank you all for your responses. We're going to try and do some more follow-up questions again to understand how each of your parties are actually going to phase out oil and gas as you've all committed to just now. So first question to Carol.
Merci, Fatima. Donc, on va commencer avec le ministre Wilkinson. Donc, on vous a entendu dire cette semaine que le pipeline Trans Mountain et son expansion pourraient rester opérationnels pour un autre 30 à 40 ans. D'autre part, ça fait partie de la plateforme libérale de mettre un plafond sur les émissions du secteur pétrolier et gazier. Donc, est-ce qu'on doit en conclure que ce nouveau mécanisme-là ne visera pas spécifiquement la production et l'exportation gazière au Canada?
You're directing, the translation was difficult, and then I switched to yours, so I'm not sure I caught all of it, but that was for me or it was for Mr. Albas?
Pour vous.
Okay, d'accord.
Je peux redemander.
Okay, so clearly, in order to achieve net zero, just from a logical perspective, you have to make reductions across the piece, every sector, and that's every sector with emissions, whether that's agriculture or it's steel or it's buildings, it's electricity generation, and certainly in this country, the two largest sources of emissions are the oil and gas sector and transportation. And of course, those emissions are linked because the primary use of oil is actually as gasoline and diesel fuel. So the focus has to be on driving emissions down. In the oil and gas sector, the way in which the cap and the binding reductions work is it will force reductions both over time in emissions intensity and in production. There's no way to get to net zero by 2050 in the oil and gas space if you're not actually looking at both of those levers. But it's the same thing is true in all of the different sectors, and part of that's about reducing demand, right? I mean, we are one of the most ambitious in the world with respect to transportation, saying that we will not allow internal combustion engines to be sold as light-duty vehicles after 2035. It'll be 100% zero-emission vehicles. That will have a major impact on demand for oil and gas. I mean, that is actually true for the Conservative Party, except that their number is 30% of vehicles being zero emission by then. That will also have an effect on demand for oil. So absolutely, we have to be looking to drive down emissions. Part of that is through driving down demand, and part of that is actually working to ensure that the sector itself is making progress on an ongoing basis.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkinson. My follow-up question is for Mr. Albas. Your party's platform promises to undo the changes ushered in by Bill C-69, which modernized how Canada reviews major resource projects. And your party also promises to repeal Bill C-48, which banned oil tankers on BC's north coast. And if repealed, could reopen the door to the Enbridge Northern Gateway oil sands pipeline. Your party has also promised to make oil export pipelines a priority and implement a federal LNG export strategy. Critics looking at this are worried that you've got a lot of focus on oil and gas, which the science says that we need to take away from and reduce, like the original question was, to phase out oil and gas. How do you respond to this? How do we meet our targets if we're also doing all the things your party is proposing with oil and gas?
I think we have to look at the reality that today we do have a lot of people that use internal combustion engines. There are shortages of electric vehicles right across the country. The government has not put a focus on that. We believe that we will take the model used in British Columbia that's been very successful. BC has some of the highest adoption of electric vehicles, and we'll put that right out across the country. Unfortunately, the Liberals just have let this one slide. What we are also talking about, those with Indigenous communities, for example, Todd Doherty, the member of Parliament for that area, I met with chiefs and representations from First Nations in the area that were affected by C-48, and they told they were not even consulted. This government likes to do things by the stroke of a pen. It doesn't like to actually work with First Nations and to try and find that balance. For example, we'd like to see more Indigenous involvement in energy projects and from all different types. We also want to see red tape from, if someone wants to put in new technology to lower the footprint of existing oil and gas, or propose a new one that significantly reduces emission. There's negative emissions technology. We have money in our budget for the use, the study of modular reactors. Those things are the way that we can balance seeing jobs at the same time lowering emissions from the oil sands and other parts of the energy sector. It's finding the balance, not just writing off communities, nor ignoring that the new technologies that are coming out could be a big advantage to Canada, and we can do a lot working with provinces and territories, not the way that this government has. I find, quite honestly, Mr. Wilkinson is a nice man, but quite honestly, I think his government treats provinces more like punching bags than partners, and we need all hands on deck.
Merci, Monsieur Albas. Une dernière question de suivi à Madame Collins. Malgré des engagements de mettre fin à l'utilisation du charbon thermique domestiquement, le Canada continue d'exporter autant du charbon canadien que du charbon thermique, pour qu'il soit brûlé à l'étranger pour de l'électricité. Les Verts et les libéraux, dans leur plateforme, ont des engagements pour faire face à cela. Qu'est-ce que vous proposez pour mettre fin à l'exportation de charbon thermique au Canada?
Absolutely. We need to eliminate the export of thermal coal. And I'm not 100% sure I caught the entire translation, but New Democrats are committed to ensuring that we end the export of thermal coal. Coal is one of the dirtiest fossil fuels. We should not be producing new coal mines here in Canada. My colleague Heather McPherson has been a champion when it comes to fighting against the proposed coal mines in Alberta. It is unbelievable to me that we would ever approve. And I do want to give some credit to the minister for actually finally saying that these coal mines would need federal approval and for stopping doing them. When it comes to thermal coal, this should be a no-brainer. It is the lowest hanging fruit.
Thank you so much. We're now going to move on to our next question, which is going to be about just transition, and Carol's going to ask.
Merci beaucoup, Fatima. Merci aux candidates et candidats pour leur réponse. Donc, nous avons entendu au cours de nombreuses fois pendant les dernières semaines comment vos partis proposent de soutenir les travailleurs et travailleuses ainsi que les familles dans l'Ouest. Selon un rapport publié en 2021 par Environmental Defense, l'emploi salarié dans les sous-secteurs des industries fossiles a baissé d'environ 33 000 postes entre 2014 et 2019, soit de plus de 17 %. L'élimination progressive et prévue de l'emploi dans l'industrie des énergies fossiles a donc déjà commencé, pas seulement à cause de l'impératif climatique, mais aussi à cause du rythme de l'automatisation des emplois dans le secteur et aussi le fait que les investissements quittent le secteur mondialement. Donc, on aimerait savoir si vos partis s'engagent à mettre en place un conseil consultatif indépendant permanent sur la transition juste qui travaillera conjointement avec celui sur la carboneutralité, chargé d'établir le processus, les mécanismes, les outils, les indicateurs de résultats et le financement d'une transition juste. Et on aimerait savoir aussi quel serait votre échéancier. Donc, on va commencer avec Monsieur le ministre Wilkinson, s'il vous plaît.
Okay, thanks. I guess I get to go first a lot. Look, I don't think you're going to find a lot of differences amongst all of the parties in saying that workers and communities must be supported as we move through an energy transition. That is critically important for any federal government of any political stripe, in the sense that it is not a responsible position for any federal government to say that they do not care about some region of the country. We all have to be thoughtful about ensuring there's economic opportunity for families that live in every region of this country. When we talk about the just transition, I think it's really critical that we talk about what we mean by that. And I think what we mean by that are two things. One is economic diversification that will create jobs. And the second is supports for skills training to ensure that people can make the transition, as the economy itself makes the transition. We have done this before with coal, workers who were involved in communities that actually dealt with coal. We worked through a just transition process with a committee that actually went around the country that included industry and labor, Indigenous peoples, to try to develop pathways for that kind of diversification and skills training to enable workers to move forward. That is certainly something that we need to do here. We made significant investments in skills training in the last budget. We had $1.5 billion for a biofuels fund that is an opportunity from the agricultural perspective, but also from the processing perspective. Our platform has a $2 billion fund for Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, and Labrador to help to think through how we would best diversify those economies that would need to include workers and unions and educational institutions and industry and environmental organizations. And certainly we need to ensure that those are tailored regionally. We have committed to put in place a Clean Jobs Training Center that would help to upgrade workers. And we are out consulting right now on the development of the Just Transition Act, which is something that we committed to do, that we will be bringing forward. At the end of the day, it is really important that we work on this. Obviously, it is best if we can coordinate our efforts with provincial governments, and we will endeavor certainly to do that on an ongoing basis. But with respect to climate action and a little bit in response to Mr. Albas, I mean, it is important to work, and certainly the work we've done with Quebec and BC shows how you can accelerate climate action if you work constructively together. But you have to actually work constructively together. And, you know, Alberta and Saskatchewan at this point don't even have a climate target. I mean, you know, Premier Michaud just put a tax on electric vehicles. I mean, at a certain point, we actually do need everybody at all levels to get serious about climate action.
Merci, Monsieur le ministre. On va maintenant passer à Madame Michaud du Bloc québécois.
Merci beaucoup. Mais c'est clair qu'on est solidaire avec les travailleurs de l'Ouest et on le dit souvent, on pense qu'il faut les aider à faire la transition énergétique, donc prendre tout l'argent qu'on met dans le pétrole, qu'on met dans les industries fossiles en ce moment et les mettre dans la transition, dans les énergies plus vertes, dans le développement de nouvelles technologies pour eux. Et c'est d'ailleurs au nom de cette solidarité-là qu'on a accepté que le gouvernement canadien dépense 1,7 milliard de dollars pour le nettoyage des puits orphelins, même si c'était une catastrophe environnementale et que ça ne doit pas se reproduire. Mais bon, on est assez solidaires. Et en ce qui concerne les emplois, je pense que c'est un peu le cas ici, dans ma région, en tout cas, c'est l'est partout au Québec et probablement partout au pays. Il y a une pénurie de main-d'œuvre et je pense que la solution pour nos entreprises, c'est justement de gagner en productivité grâce aux nouvelles technologies, grâce également à l'automatisation. Donc, et en fait, pour le comité proposé, ben, on ne s'y oppose pas. Je pense que ça peut être une bonne idée, mais je ne compterais pas trop sur peut-être les libéraux ou le NPD pour la mise en place d'un tel comité, parce que lors de l'étude du projet de loi C12, on voulait justement ajouter un expert en santé sur le comité d'experts et notre proposition n'a pas passé. Alors, quand même, il faudrait s'asseoir avec tous les experts à la table pour être certain qu'on a un véritable comité. Et je dirais que le Bloc est assez... bon, il y a des belles propositions vertes et c'est ce qu'on a fait tout au long de la campagne. Des propositions positives pour l'aluminium carboneutre, la foresterie durable, un véritable hydrogène qui serait vert, qui est produit par l'électrolyse de l'eau, pas un hydrogène gris. On a des propositions pour la finance verte également, donc, et des propositions pour que les grandes banques fassent leur part justement pour financer la transition énergétique. Alors, je pense que ce n'est pas une question de ne plus être avec les travailleurs de l'Ouest, mais d'être solidaire avec eux et de les aider à faire la transition.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Michaud. On va maintenant passer à Monsieur Szeman, s'il vous plaît, du Parti vert.
All right, thank you very much. I have to also make a comment at the beginning, and that is that Ms. Collins always discusses the government as if the NDP was separate from it. I had thought her party held the balance of power, and so she could have influenced, climate policy in her role, and her party could have as well. But perhaps I'm missing something, and I can be corrected about that. I think Mr. Wilkinson is right. All of us are going to have versions of a transition strategy. So in the interest of keeping things a bit shorter and going slower for the translators, let me turn to the part of the question that I haven't heard anybody talk about yet, and that's this the creation of a transition advisory council. So in our platform, we state explicitly that those most impacted by energy transition, which will include workers in greenhouse gas intensive industries, but also Indigenous people and marginalized communities, that these people would play a lead role in the preparation of their transition strategies. And unions would certainly be important partners in this, even if unionization has been stifled by industry in fossil fuel industries. Unifor, Canada's biggest private sector union, which has 12,000 members working in the oil and gas industry, they've indicated their support of a just transition program away from oil and gas, and other unions have as well. And Uniforms also agreed that Canada should reduce its emissions by 60% of its 2005 levels, precisely the levels to which the Green Party has committed. Now, my late father worked in the fossil fuel industry his entire life. I'm originally from Alberta, though I'm in BC right now. He wasn't committed to the industry in a way I think a lot of the image of what oil workers in Alberta are, like that's everything to them. What he wanted was fair and well-paid work.
Merci,
And
M. Simon.
all right, thanks very much.
Merci, désolé, on doit vous couper. On passe maintenant à M. Albas du Parti conservateur.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if it was my turn, but so thank you for the question. So first of all, we've talked a little bit about this government's approach to working with provinces. Remember that the original targets that were taken to Paris by this government were negotiated with all provinces and territories. It was what each province agreed to. We've seen this government suddenly raise those targets without ever actually having put a dent in greenhouse gas emissions. And provinces have many of the most important levers when it comes to climate change. So everything from transportation, energy, natural resource development, housing, agriculture, there are so many elements there. And this government just has failed to work with provinces on instituting any kind of organized plan. So we give from Ottawa, there's billions of dollars every year that are given to provinces for retraining funds. And it is a very sloppy job done by this government. They have not actually helped people to transition into new important careers because there has been a lot of unemployment since 2015, particularly in the prairie provinces that depend on the energy sector. And the government has put together a greener homes initiative. But guess what? People try to see if they can access it, but they can't find anyone that has the qualifications for energy efficiency and evaluation. So the government keeps trying to say that it's doing all the right things, but we see billions of dollars that are not going towards helping people today. Now, I do agree with Mr. Wilkinson that we have a responsibility to work with the provinces because ultimately it's their responsibility for skills and training, but we got to stop hitting them and treating provinces divisively. He's spoken a number of times against certain premiers. That's not how you get things done. We'll do better. Thank you.
On va maintenant terminer avec Madame Collins du NPD.
First, I just want to respond to Mr. Zeman's question about how the Parliament worked over the past 2 years. The Liberals had the NDP, the Conservatives, and the Bloc holding the balance of power. So they could choose and see who supported them, which makes it, I think, in my opinion, even more impressive how we were able to strengthen their net zero legislation, get more supports for people through the pandemic. But to the question, we need to make sure that the workers who are most impacted by the changes in our economy do not pay the price for inaction on the climate crisis. And we are committed to working with workers, unions, employers, and provinces and territories to ensure that we have the solutions for a just transition and that we have a transition that leaves no one behind. So whether we are forming government or holding the balance of power, I will fight to ensure we have an independent advisory council on the just transition, but also that we have concrete actions to support workers. And it is interesting to hear the minister talking about a just transition because in Parliament, none of the ministers for the past 2 years have even said the words just transition, not once. And so, in the past year, it has only been, just in 2020 alone, it's only been the Green Party and the NDP who even said the words just transition. The Bloc had said it earlier in 2020. But why are the ministers responsible not even using the words just transition if they are committed and then days before an election?
Merci, Madame Collins. Je passe la parole à Fatima pour les questions de suivi.
Thanks, Carol. My first follow-up question is for Mr. Szeman. You say in the Green Platform that you will replace every fossil fuel job with green sector jobs. What are those jobs and which policy mechanisms will you use to create them?
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, I think when people imagine the replacement of fossil fuel sector jobs, they often imagine that it has to go into a renewable energy job. And that, I think, is where one of the errors is. The jobs can be located across all sectors. And the mechanisms will do that is by training and also providing a fund in order to enable this, both in terms of training, but also in job creation. And also there'll be a green fund to enable specific transitions of all sectors of the industry towards a more green economy.
Merci, Monsieur Szeman. Prochaine question de suivi pour Madame Michaud du Bloc québécois. Donc, votre parti propose une péréquation verte. Essentiellement, une telle formule enverrait davantage d'argent aux provinces qui performent déjà relativement mieux en matière de réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre, comme le Québec. Donc, comment est-ce qu'une telle formule soutiendrait les travailleurs et travailleuses des provinces productrices de pétrole et de gaz?
Merci pour la question. Bien, ça va me permettre de revenir sur ça. Je n'ai pas eu le temps au départ. La péréquation verte, c'est assez simple. On utilise le principe du pollueur-payeur. Alors, les provinces qui sont meilleurs joueurs, on peut penser au Québec, par exemple, celles qui produisent moins que la moyenne canadienne d'émissions de gaz à effet de serre, bien, pourraient recevoir un certain montant payé par ceux qui produisent plus. Donc, c'est un certain incitatif à produire moins, si vous voulez. Mais je pense qu'on utilise souvent l'expression « on peut mâcher de la gomme et marcher en même temps », dans le sens où la péréquation verte n'est pas la seule solution. On peut, comme je l'ai dit un petit peu plus tôt, changer notre façon d'investir, donc cesser les subventions aux énergies fossiles, mais plutôt investir ces sous-là dans la transition énergétique, dans la transition verte, qui viendrait soutenir les travailleurs des industries les plus polluantes, donc les travailleurs de l'Ouest, bien entendu. Alors, on ne compte peut-être pas sur la péréquation verte pour soutenir les travailleurs, mais il y a d'autres façons de le faire et en cessant de subventionner les industries de cette façon-là, je pense que ça pourrait être une bonne façon de faire.
Thank you so much. We're going to move on to our next section, which is going to be about leaving no one behind. As we all know, the effects of climate change are felt first and most violently by those in communities that are marginalized. That includes Indigenous peoples, people of color, those with disabilities, people in lower income brackets who struggle financially, and those living in developing countries. The list goes on. What are your party's strategies for adaptation for the most vulnerable communities? We'll start with Mr. Albas.
Great, thank you very much. Karl Popper was a philosopher of science, and he spoke about something called reverse utilitarianism, which instead of focusing on policies that make everyone as happy as possible, you instead focus on those that are suffering the most. So you target help for those that are needed, where help is needed. So again, we want to make sure that people have safe drinking water right across this country. The Liberals have not done that. We also want to ensure that Indigenous reconciliation happens on their terms. And so, as I've said, I've worked on, and many of our members have worked on, advocating for projects, whether they be on the natural resource or renewable energy side. And those things should continue. We've also talked in our platform for Canada's recovery plan, the needs to have it to unleash some of the tight rules around international assistance. Right now, a Canadian charity operating in a foreign country has to show they have complete control over everything. And oftentimes in those countries, that's not how it works there. They need to partner with other agencies on the ground. So we are going to work to try to listen, to work with people on their challenges and try and get better results while getting, and again, results is the key point. I think everyone knows that Mr. Trudeau will often look at you, hand on his heart, and say, I promise I will plant 2 billion trees. I promise I will work on a just transition. And as Ms. Collins has remarked, they don't then talk about those after. We need a government that will actually say what it'll do and then do it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Szeman.
Sorry about that. I'm going to speak to Canada's international commitments with this question. Greenhouse gases don't stop at national borders. They don't need a passport to get into Canada, or our emissions don't need a passport to get into other countries. As one of the world's highest per capita emitters of greenhouse gases, Canada has a responsibility to support the climate action efforts of other countries and to attend to the energy poverty and disproportionate impacts of climate change. The numbers that have been put out there by other parties, whether it's 30% or 40% or 50% for domestic reductions, are only part of the story. And I must admit to still being confused where these figures come from, since I can't see that they're based on research or science. The Green Party is going to develop its climate policy in order to fulfill its existing commitments to international climate change efforts. We'll submit a revised nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement that reflects our fair share of emissions reductions while ramping up climate finance to $4 billion US per year to support climate mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage in developed countries. We'll also invest in green infrastructure in developing countries to offset energy poverty. The rich and wealthy of this world have already benefited from their disproportionate access to energy. They now have an ethical obligation to address the consequences of fossil fuel use and to ensure that developing countries have access to adequate supplies of energy to improve the lives of individuals and communities within their borders. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Michaud.
Merci. Comme dans tout, c'est toujours un peu les plus vulnérables qui sont touchés en premier, malheureusement. Et au Québec, il y a quelque chose d'assez intéressant qui existe et c'est le droit de vivre dans un environnement sain et respectueux de la biodiversité. C'est inscrit dans la Charte québécoise des droits et libertés depuis 2006. Donc, je pense que le gouvernement canadien pourrait espérer introduire un droit similaire dans le préambule de la loi canadienne sur la protection de l'environnement. Ça aura une portée juridique limitée, certes, mais je pense que ça peut avoir une portée symbolique et ce serait un bon pas en avant pour la justice environnementale. Je pense qu'une des meilleures façons de lutter, c'est de défendre la souveraineté environnementale de nos territoires, des territoires des Premières Nations, du territoire du Québec, de ceux des provinces également. Et comme les changements climatiques, c'est prouvé, affectent de plus en plus la santé des humains, mais je pense que pour la justice environnementale, une bonne façon de lutter aussi, c'est de prendre soin de notre monde, prendre soin de leur santé. Et on sait que les réseaux de la santé sont gérés par les provinces, par le Québec. Alors pour nous, c'est essentiel qu'on transfère les sommes et vous entendez souvent le Bloc québécois en parler, mais c'est essentiel aussi dans la lutte au changement climatique pour que le Québec puisse prendre soin de la santé de son monde, alors de transférer les sommes à la hauteur de 35%. Donc, ça représenterait une enveloppe de 28 milliards pour le Québec, pour les provinces également, et ce, sans condition. Sinon, le Canada a un grand rôle à jouer dans l'aide internationale. Je pense qu'il peut préconiser une hausse substantielle de l'enveloppe qui est dédiée au développement. Il y avait des trucs qui avaient été proposés à l'Assemblée des Nations unies pour augmenter l'aide internationale en fonction du produit national brut. Donc, je pense que ça pourrait être une bonne façon de financer le climat pour les pays en développement.
Thank you so much. Ms. Collins.
Thank you. And far too often, the impacts of climate change are disproportionately borne by marginalized communities. And so an NDP government would ensure that investments are directed towards reducing inequality, to honoring and upholding Indigenous rights, and to supporting communities that have been left behind by consecutive Liberal and Conservative governments. We absolutely need to increase our climate financing globally. But we also need to make sure that we are investing in and supporting communities here in Canada who are experiencing, record-breaking heat waves, climate fires, flooding. We have committed to creating an Office of Environmental Justice to address the disproportionate impacts of pollution and loss of biodiversity on low-income, racialized, and other marginalized communities. One of the reasons I got into politics is because of the climate crisis. And the reason I chose the NDP is because I saw only in this party a commitment to the interconnection between environmental justice and social justice. And it is so essential that we move forward and ensure that no one is left behind.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Wilkinson, you go last this time.
Well, thank you. So I actually agree with a lot of the things that both Kristina and Laurel and Imre said. Hope I got that right. So environmental justice is certainly bigger than climate. It's a broader subject, and there are definitely both international and domestic kind of lenses on this. Au niveau international, nous nous sommes récemment engagés à doubler notre engagement en matière de financement climatique pour la porter à 5 milliards de dollars. So, you know, the funds that we have committed, the doubling of international climate funds, are focused on addressing the challenges faced by developing countries. That's not just adaptation, it's also mitigation, but it's certainly also a focus on the protection of biodiversity around the world. Canada was actually recently asked to co-lead the corralling of the $100 billion commitment that the developed world made to the developing world as part of the deal that was done at Paris. We were asked to co-lead this by the international community with Germany. And so we are working very actively on that, but I think it's a recognition of the important and significant role that Canada is increasingly playing in the climate field internationally. Beyond international action, obviously, we need to be thinking about environmental justice within this country. There was a bill that was actually introduced into Parliament in the last Parliament. It was actually sponsored by a private member named Laurel Collins. The focus was on looking at sort of the disproportionate impacts on Indigenous communities and focusing on requiring the Minister of the Environment, whoever that is in the future, to examine the links between race and socioeconomic status and exposure to environmental risk. The other thing that we did, and we will do again, is we introduced into Parliament a modernization of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And one element of that was included for the first time in Canadian law was the right to a healthy environment, which again focuses very much on the disproportionate impacts on vulnerable populations. And so those issues around environmental justice are really important, and they will need to continue to be a priority for us as we move forward.
Thank you so much. We'll have 2 follow-up questions, starting with Carol.
Merci, Fatima. On va commencer avec Madame Michaud du Bloc québécois. Donc, on vous a entendu sur notamment les transferts en santé. On connaît la position du Bloc québécois sur la question de juridiction et de façon générale sur des normes nationales. Donc, ça serait quoi en fait la position du Bloc sur une stratégie nationale pour faire face au racisme environnemental, notamment le projet de loi C-230 qui a été déposé sur la justice environnementale?
Merci, Caroline. Très bonne question. Le Bloc québécois est favorable, bien entendu, à la mise en place. Et tu le dis, là, habituellement, on est très à cheval sur le respect des compétences des juridictions, tout le monde, mais il y a certaines choses, comme la crise climatique, c'est un exemple qui doivent être pris de façon globale. Et c'est un peu la même chose, la lutte climatique et ce qu'elle décline. Donc, le racisme environnemental, ça fait partie de ça. Je pense que toutes les solutions sont les bienvenues et il y en avait de très bonnes qui étaient proposées dans le projet de loi de Mme Zan. Et j'espère qu'elle va le redéposer à nouveau parce que le Bloc québécois était en faveur de certaines choses dans ce projet de loi-là. On était aussi ouvert à travailler pour aller modifier certaines choses qui étaient proposées, mais je crois que c'est un sujet qui doit certainement être mis à l'avant dans la lutte au changement climatique et on sera prêt à collaborer avec les autres parties pour ça.
Thank you so much. My follow-up question is for Mr. Albas. Part of adaptation strategies includes nature-based solutions. The Conservative Party has not committed to the 30% land and ocean protection goals that we've seen others commit to by 2030. There's very little in the platform about nature-based solutions. And I'm wondering if you can address that and tell us what the plan is for the Conservatives in this regard.
Yes, I'd be happy to. So I've actually held the minister to account a committee in regards to this. And to be fair, the commitment of 30% by 2030 is the largest amount of conservation in the history of Canada. And so It's just the amount of lands and making sure that it is done right is something that Parliament needs to do. Unfortunately, the minister has been very opaque on that. Now, in regards to nature-based solutions, we actually have a section of Secure the Environment where we'll say we'll invest $3 billion in nature-based solutions. And part of that is to deal with if someone wants to use wetlands as a way to store carbon, at the same time deal with flood mitigation, or perhaps to deal with drought situations. That is something that we will absolutely support. We also want to work with ranchers, with farmers and foresters, and we'll make sure that that there are funds available to conserve those things. We also want to see Indigenous protected and conservation areas. We want to see more Indigenous guardian programs go up. Oftentimes the government, will say, or a First Nation band will say, we've conserved this area, but we have no funds to actually improve the habitat. This government has done a very poor job on talking about adaptation and resiliency. This is something that we will invest in. And again, you can count on a Conservative government to perform and get results.
Thank you so much for your response. So we're almost at the end of this session, and this is the part where a normal conversation would have closing statements. We've decided to switch it up. I'm going to ask each of the candidates one question about something in their platform or their policy, and they're going to respond hopefully in just over a minute because we're tight on time, and we'll see how it goes. So my first question is for Mr. Szeman. In recent months, while Canada was dealing with deadly wildfires and extreme weather fueled by climate change, the Green Party was consumed by infighting. How can voters be sure that if elected into office, Green MPs will be focused on your party's core issue?
Internal disputes around leaders are endemic to Canadian politics. Does anybody remember Andrew Scheer, for instance, or Stéphane Dion? It doesn't take away from a party's mission and a party's core values. The Green Party is committed to environmental change, to climate policy, to social justice. It's all laid out in our platform. It's something that's been part of the policy of the party from the very beginning. Our policies on climate are the most ambitious ones that are out there in this election. And yet they're only ambitious in the context of Canada. Other countries have done the same as we're suggesting. 60% is what is now suggested by organizations like your own as what we have to move towards in order to hit IPCC targets. The Green Party is committed to doing that. Whether or not we have internal issues, we are going to fight to make this happen. And we have to make it happen because there's no other choice. The other parties, I'm afraid,
thank you so much, Mr. Szeman. Sorry to
are not doing the work they need to.
Thank you. Ms. Collins, experts say that your climate plans lack serious detail or pathways. How do you balance being tough on climate change without wiping out entire industries or seeing jobs move overseas?
The experts that Mr. Wilkinson was referring to, Mark Jacquard, I don't think he actually clearly read our platform. We not only have a price on carbon, but we don't actually consider that a silver bullet. We are going to need so much more. We have details about the concrete steps that we are taking, including transportation mode shift, including investing in renewables, including making sure that we retrofit all of our buildings and move to zero emission vehicles, electrifying transit. We have a bold, ambitious plan to tackle the climate crisis. And unlike this Liberal government, we won't just talk about the actions, we'll actually do them. Right now we are in a climate emergency, and Canadians want a government that doesn't just make promises, but one that delivers on them. We need to do this for our children, for our grandchildren, and for future generations.
Thank you. My next question is for Mr. Albas. It took 3 years for the Liberal government to introduce carbon pricing. If elected, how long will it take for the Conservatives to set up a low carbon savings account?
Well, thank you very much for the question. So Mr. O'Toole is already committed to meeting with every premier to talk about this. Some premiers may say we have a better carbon price a mousetrap, and so we'll work with them on those things. But this is important to have all of these things, whether it be renewable natural gas mandate, a low carbon fuel standard, an electric vehicle mandate. There's many things that I think many of the other parties here would support. So these are the actions we would take immediately to start moving us towards real results. Unfortunately, we've seen greenhouse gases year after year go up under Mr. Trudeau, and that's just not getting it done. We want to see more habitat restoration, and we also want to see more jobs. And so the Conservatives in our Secure the Environment plan, we have that. I'd encourage people to go to conservative.ca/plan to see the Canada's recovery plan. And I just would like to say we want to work with everyone towards having an environment and have a government where we can be proud of.
Ms. Michaud, how can you support the construction of new roads if you're serious about climate and reducing transportation emissions?
Merci pour la question, je l'attendais. En fait, je ne sais pas à quel point le reste du Canada est au fait de ce fameux projet de Québec de troisième lien, mais ça me donne l'opportunité d'en parler. En fait, je pense que ce qui a été dit, c'est si on doit aller de l'avant avec de grands projets d'infrastructure, aussi bien les rendre les plus écologiques possibles, mais je ne crois pas que ce soit la solution. Je ne crois pas que ce soit le rôle d'un parti fédéral non plus d'aller dire au Québec ou aux provinces si leurs projets sont écologiques ou non. Nous, notre rôle, c'est quand le fédéral a une part de financement dans un projet d'infrastructure et qu'il peut mettre les sous des contribuables dedans, comme dans Trans Mountain, par exemple. Là, c'est le rôle d'un parti fédéral d'aller dire que c'est pas bon pour l'environnement et qu'on doit faire autrement. Alors, je crois qu'il faut choisir soigneusement nos projets d'infrastructure, du moins celles qui relèvent du fédéral, et c'est pour ça qu'on propose un test climat pour toutes les politiques, pour tous les projets qui seront mis de l'avant dans le futur pour être certains qu'il n'y a pas d'impact sur l'environnement dans le futur.
Thank you so much. And last, but certainly not least, Mr. Wilkinson, you promised to plant 2 billion trees in 2019. We heard that the government has just started to plant 30 million. Your party committed to a just transition during the 2019 election, but only started a consultation process right before this election. How can voters trust that you will follow through on all the climate promises you make with ambition and urgency?
Well, I think the proof is in the pudding. We have made enormous progress over the past few years. The tree program is underway, a whole range of other programs across every sector of the economy. I mean, look at any of the experts. People try to focus on Mark Jaccard, although I would say Mark Jaccard actually advises other governments, including the government of British Columbia, which is an NDP government. But look, atmospheric scientist Catherine Hayhoe, Stuart Elgie from the University of Ottawa, Generation Squeeze from UBC, climate scientist and former BC Green Party leader Andrew Weaver, all say the Liberal Party plan is best. We have been the best in terms of moving forward. In fact, the quote that Stuart Elgie said was the current Liberal government's done more to tackle climate change than the previous governments did in over 20 years and almost more than any other government in the world at this time. So look at the record. I mean, the record is strong. We have developed a plan that will enable us to move forward and to ensure that we're fighting the climate crisis that we need to.
Merci tout le monde pour vos réponses. On arrive à la fin de la table ronde. Donc, un énorme merci aux candidates et candidats qui ont pris du temps dans leur horaire qu'on sait très chargé en ce moment pour répondre à nos questions très pointues ce soir. Un énorme merci à Fatima également. Le réseau Action Climat Canada est honoré d'avoir une journaliste de son envergure comme modératrice de ce débat. Une des choses les plus importantes qu'on peut faire en matière d'action climatique comme citoyen, c'est d'en parler ensemble en tant que communauté. Et c'est ça qu'on a fait ce soir. Et malgré les différences d'opinion, on remercie tout le monde qui était là, incluant les nombreux participants qui se sont rassemblés en très grand nombre. Un petit rappel que le réseau Action Climat Canada a soumis un questionnaire aux partis politiques. Nous avons publié les réponses ce matin. On va mettre des liens dans le chat pour ceux qui voudraient aller les consulter et nous invitons aussi à lire la liste de nos priorités électorales. Donc, un gros merci à tout le monde, incluant à l'équipe du réseau, en particulier Lauren, qui a rendu cet événement possible.
I just want to thank the candidates again for your time this evening. It's so close to Election Day and for answering all our questions. I really do appreciate it. And thank you to all of you for listening in. If you have any questions or concerns, please do get in touch. We hope you learned something, and please go vote on Monday. Have a good evening.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
So much, folks. Merci.